Halloween. The air was sharp, cold, and thick with the smell of burning leaves, a stark reminder of the season's swift arrival. My parents had gone to a friend's house for the evening, leaving me alone. It was nothing new, they trusted me to keep the house in order, but something about that night felt different, more isolating. The world outside had darkened early, casting deep shadows across the floor. My name is Lisa, and here's my story. I never celebrated Halloween. Not like the others who dressed as skeletons or ghosts, roaming the streets for candy or mischief. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy the holiday, it just wasn't for me. That night, though, it became something I'd never forget. Something no one could forget. The house had grown eerily silent, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of your own breath, the ticking of the clock, and every tiny creak the house made as it settled in the cold. I tried to distract myself by watching videos, something mindless to pass the time until my parents came back. I wasn't expecting them until late, so I wrapped myself in a blanket, huddled on the couch, and let the minutes stretch. The knock didn't come immediately. It was subtle at first, like the sound of something small, distant. I dismissed it as the neighbors, maybe, even though they lived far enough away that I shouldn't have been able to hear them. But when the sound came again, a dull thud that seemed to come from above, I froze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, right above me. But here's the thing, I lived on the top floor. Cold sweat trickled down my spine as the footsteps continued, circling the perimeter of the ceiling. I grabbed the blanket tighter, almost as if that thin layer of fabric could somehow shield me from whatever was moving above. My heart raced, the pulse of fear beating louder in my ears than the footsteps. Maybe the wind had knocked something loose. Maybe it was the house shifting. That's when the first knock came. A single, sharp knock against the wall beside me. I remember turning slowly, my breath shallow, as if the very act of breathing too loud might alert whatever was outside. But nothing was there. Just the dark expanse of the wall. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound, but there was only silence. 2 hours passed like this, just me, curled on the couch, waiting for something to happen. I drifted in and out of a restless sleep, but each time I woke, the house was quiet again. Until the knock returned, louder, clearer. And this time, it wasn't alone. I don't know how to explain it, but the sound wasn't just on the roof anymore. It was, inside. Something had entered. Something was moving through the house, knocking on walls, doors, windows. And with each knock, the space between them grew shorter, more insistent, until it was as if the entire house was being surrounded. Enclosed. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. My body was paralyzed with a terror so deep that it felt like I was sinking into the couch, swallowed whole by it. I gripped the blanket, staring wide-eyed at the front door, where the final knock landed with a force that rattled the frame. Then, silence. Complete, suffocating silence. And a voice, soft, barely more than a whisper, slithered through the stillness, just loud enough to pierce the quiet. PSSST. It was a sound so foreign in the darkness, yet so unnervingly close. The hairs on my arms stood on end, my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely think. PSSST. Just let me in. Every muscle in my body locked as I shot out of bed, unable to breathe, my mind whirling. What had entered my house? Part 2, The Whisperer. I stood in the middle of the room, heart pounding in my chest like a hammer against bone, staring at the front door. The voice had come from behind it, but there was no shadow visible through the small frosted window. The knock had been real, the whisper undeniably close, but it was as if the very air outside was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. It felt wrong, every instinct in me screamed to stay away, to ignore the whispers that still echoed faintly in my ears. But something about it, about him, was almost magnetic. It wasn't that I wanted to go to the door, but I felt compelled to. Like I had to. My hand moved toward the latch without me realizing, shaking slightly as my fingers brushed against the cold metal. The whispers started again, but this time they were more insistent. "PSSST, just open the door. I've been waiting, all night." The voice, sickly sweet and almost playful, slithered through the cracks in the frame, curling itself around my thoughts. It was close, too close. I was shaking now, not from the cold, but from the sheer dread that gripped my spine like a vice. I hadn't spoken a word yet, not to myself, not to the thing outside. And I wouldn't. I knew better. This wasn't a conversation. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled, as if someone was testing it, applying just enough pressure to send a ripple of terror through my chest. My legs almost gave out beneath me, but I stepped back, clutching the blanket against my chest as if it were a shield. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, to hide, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my breath quickening with each agonizing second. Another knock came. This one softer, but somehow more menacing than the last. "Lisa," the voice oozed through the air like honey dripping from a poisoned comb. It knew my name. I choked down a gasp. How did it know my name? I hadn't told anyone I was alone. I hadn't even celebrated Halloween tonight. My parents weren't supposed to be back for hours, and even if it was them, they wouldn't knock. They had keys. Then I heard it again, louder this time. "Lisa, it's me. Just let me in. I won't hurt you. I promise." The voice was trying to sound friendly now, coaxing me like a child into a game I didn't want to play. But there was an underlying edge to it, a sharpness hidden beneath the sweetness. I backed up, my eyes darting between the door and the windows. All the shutters were closed, locked. But the house, it felt so much smaller now, like the walls were slowly closing in, like he was squeezing his way in through the cracks. I couldn't stay here, waiting for whatever was outside to find another way in. Suddenly, a loud bang came from upstairs, something heavy crashing to the floor, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. I froze, my eyes wide with terror as I realized. I wasn't alone anymore. There was no time to think. I ran for the stairs, my feet moving on instinct, the thick blanket dragging behind me like a cloak of fear. Whatever had fallen, whatever had made that sound, was in my parents' room. I didn't want to go up there, but I had no choice. I couldn't stay near the door, not with that thing whispering my name through the walls. I reached the top of the stairs just as I heard another thud, closer this time, like something was being dragged across the floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I crept toward the hallway, my hand shaking as I reached for the light switch. The hallway flickered to life, the dim bulb casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I stared at my parents' bedroom door. It was half open, swaying slightly, as if someone had just passed through. The air was colder up here, much colder than downstairs. It felt wrong, like something had slipped into the house, something dark and unseen. My hand hovered over the door handle, my stomach twisting with fear. Whatever was in there, I wasn't ready to face it. But before I could decide what to do, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing inside the room. "Lisa," the voice, the same one from downstairs, echoed through the door. "I'm waiting, just let me in." This time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. I took a step back, nearly tripping over myself in panic. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as the door creaked open just a little more, the darkness within beckoning me forward. And then, something moved in the shadows. I ran. Down the stairs, past the living room, into the kitchen. My mind was a blur, my body acting purely on instinct. I needed to get out of the house, out of the suffocating darkness that seemed to be pressing in from every corner. But as I reached the back door, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was locked. Part 3, The Lock. I stood frozen at the back door, heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out every other sound. My shaking fingers fumbled for the lock, desperate to twist it open, but the cold metal refused to budge. It felt as though it had rusted shut, a solid and unyielding barrier between me and the outside world. My breath hitched as the realization hit, something was keeping me in. Behind me, I heard the slow creak of floorboards, a deliberate and mocking sound, like footsteps moving in time with my heartbeat. It was coming down the stairs. I could feel it. Not just the sound, but the pressure, the weight of its presence drawing closer. My skin crawled, every hair on the back of my neck standing at attention. I yanked at the door, my movements frantic, the lock rattling uselessly under my grip. The thing in the house was getting closer, and I could feel it. The air seemed to thicken, every breath more difficult than the last. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, the overwhelming sense of dread threatening to paralyze me. And then, the voice came again, closer, clearer, just behind me. "Lisa, don't run." I let out a small scream, backing away from the door, my eyes wide and darting, searching for any way out. My mind raced, panicking, unable to process anything but the need to escape. But the voice was relentless, following me like a shadow. "Let me in, Lisa." I stumbled backward into the kitchen table, the chair scraping loudly against the tiled floor as I bumped into it. Every noise felt amplified in the silence of the house, every breath a rasping echo that reverberated in the suffocating air. My back pressed against the cold wood, and for a split second, I considered hiding under the table like a child. But what good would that do? Whatever was in here, it wasn't something I could hide from. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Lisa. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was here. It had followed me downstairs, and now it was standing just outside the kitchen, on the other side of the wall. I could feel its presence, its gaze boring into me, though I couldn't see it. My heart raced as the room seemed to grow colder, the lights dimming ever so slightly, as if something was draining the life out of the air around me. With trembling hands, I grabbed the closest thing to me, a kitchen knife. My fingers wrapped tightly around the handle, the sharp blade catching the faint light from the window. It was small, barely more than a paring knife, but it was all I had. I held it up in front of me, as if that would be enough to fend off whatever had invaded my home. The house was silent again. That eerie, choking silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. I waited, breath held, my pulse drumming in my ears, waiting for the next sound, the next whisper, the next step. And then, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a knock this time. It was the sound of nails, fingers, lightly scraping against the wall, like it was feeling its way toward me. The sound grew louder, closer, as it moved along the wall toward the kitchen doorway. I could almost picture it, long, thin fingers dragging themselves across the wood, leaving invisible marks. I tightened my grip on the knife, my knuckles white with fear. The sound stopped, just on the other side of the doorway. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, waiting. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it knocked. Once. Twice. 3 times. The sound was like a gunshot in the dead silence of the house, and I jumped, a terrified whimper escaping my throat. My back pressed harder against the table, my body tensed like a cornered animal. I didn't dare move. Didn't dare breathe. The knocking stopped. And then, with a low, guttural laugh, the voice spoke again. "Lisa, open the door. Let me in." It was no longer the soft, sweet tone it had used before. Now, it was deeper, darker, filled with a malice that sent chills down my spine. I knew I had to run, to get away from that door, from the voice, from whatever was in my house. But my legs wouldn't move. I was stuck, frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The door rattled as something pressed against it, testing the strength of the wood. The knob twisted slowly, as if whatever was outside was trying to force its way in. My heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. With a burst of adrenaline, I ran. I bolted toward the back door, not caring if the lock wouldn't budge, not caring that I had no plan. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. My fingers scrambled over the lock again, trying to force it open, when suddenly, a loud crack rang out. The front door flew open, slamming against the wall with a force that made the entire house shake. I spun around, knife still in hand, my breath caught in my throat. The door hung wide open, the night air swirling into the room like a cold breath of death. But no one was there. The doorway was empty. And yet, something was watching me. The air felt thick with tension, like the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. I could feel it, its gaze, its hunger. It had been outside, knocking, calling, whispering. And now the door was open. Now, it was inside. Part 4, Inside. The air in the house had shifted, thick and oppressive, like the feeling right before a thunderstorm hits. The front door hung open, the cold Halloween night spilling into the room, but the darkness outside felt too still. I stood there, paralyzed, my fingers still clutching the knife, eyes locked on the open doorway. Nothing moved. Nothing came through. But something was inside. I could feel it. Like the air was alive, buzzing with the weight of something unseen, lurking, waiting. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest, the knife shaking in my hand. The silence stretched on, wrapping itself around me like a noose tightening with every second. I glanced at the front door again, half expecting to see something standing in the threshold. But it was empty, just the night staring back at me. And yet, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I turned back toward the kitchen, my eyes scanning the room, every shadow now a potential threat. The lights flickered once, then twice, and I swallowed hard, my throat dry with fear. The cold air from the open door mixed with the warmth of the house, creating a strange, almost electric sensation that raised the hairs on my arms. And then, there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from inside the house. Slow, deliberate knocks echoed from somewhere deeper within the shadows, as if something was moving through the rooms, touching the walls, testing them, marking its path. I took another step back, the knife now raised defensively in front of me. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, my eyes darting around the room, trying to locate the source of the sound. But it was everywhere. It felt like it was coming from within the walls themselves, like the house was alive, its heartbeat pounding alongside mine. And then, the whisper returned. "Lisa. I'm here." The voice was different now, no longer sickly sweet or coaxing. It was cold, dark, full of malice. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner with dread. My stomach churned as I heard my name again, drawn out in a slow, sinister tone. I took a step toward the stairs, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get out. But the back door was still locked, and the front door, there was no way I was walking toward that open threshold. Not when I knew something was already inside. I turned toward the hallway, thinking I could escape through one of the bedroom windows, when I saw it. A shadow. It flickered just out of sight, darting from the corner of my vision like a wisp of smoke. My breath hitched, and I froze, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Lisa," the voice hissed again, closer this time. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Moving through the darkness, slipping between the walls, creeping ever closer. My pulse hammered in my chest, a desperate, frantic beat as I backed up toward the staircase, my eyes never leaving the shadowed hallway. It was in the house now, stalking me like prey. My foot landed on the first step, and that's when the smell hit me. Rot. Decay. Like something old and wet, left to fester in the dark. It filled the air, thick and rancid, and I gagged, covering my mouth with one hand as the stench clung to me, wrapping itself around my senses. It was everywhere now, seeping through the walls, oozing up from the floors. My stomach churned violently, the bile rising in my throat. I turned and bolted up the stairs. My feet barely touched the steps as I fled, the weight of the house pressing down on me like a living thing. I could hear it behind me now, the soft shuffling of something moving, no, slithering, up the stairs, its presence looming, hungry. "Don't run, Lisa," it whispered, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers racing up my spine. I reached the top of the stairs and threw myself into my room, slamming the door behind me. My back hit the wood, and I pressed against it with all my weight, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The silence in the room was suffocating, the only sound the frantic pounding of my heart. For a moment, I thought I was safe. The house below was still, the whispers had faded, and there was nothing but the faint hum of the wind outside. But then I heard the creak. The slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards just outside my door. Something was standing there. Waiting. Listening. I held my breath, my body trembling with fear as I strained to hear. The creak came again, followed by a soft, shuffling sound. It was right outside, moving closer, inch by inch. I gripped the knife tighter, pressing myself harder against the door, as if I could somehow keep it out, keep myself safe. But then, the knocking began again. 1, 2, 3. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap, like a child knocking politely to be let in. But the knocks grew louder, more insistent. My heart raced, panic rising in my throat as I heard the thing on the other side of the door press against it, testing the handle. I swallowed hard, my body frozen in place as the door rattled under its weight. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows stretching longer, darker, as if they were alive, pulsing with whatever was just beyond that door. And then, the whisper came. "Lisa, let me in. Just open the door." I bit my lip, tears welling in my eyes as the voice filled the room, cold and dripping with venom. My body shook with fear, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that whatever it was would just go away. The knocking stopped. Silence again. But this time, it felt like the silence before a storm, like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting. Then, with a soft click, the door began to open. I screamed. Part 5, The Other Side. The door creaked open slowly, the dim light from the hallway casting long, unnatural shadows across the room. My heart stopped, frozen in my chest as I watched the crack widen. I could barely breathe, my body trembling uncontrollably as the silence dragged on, each second an agonizing eternity. For a moment, nothing happened. The door hung half open, swaying gently on its hinges, and the air seemed to grow heavier, denser, pressing down on me with invisible hands. My grip on the knife tightened, but it felt useless now, like holding a toy in the face of something far bigger than I could comprehend. Then, the smell hit me again. Rotten, putrid air poured into the room, thick and suffocating, like something dead and decaying was breathing right in my face. I gagged, stumbling backward, the knife slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence, but I barely registered it. All I could focus on was the doorway. Something was there. The shadows in the hall twisted, coiling into strange shapes, bending in ways that defied logic. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no making sense of it. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, writhing and pulsing with a malevolent energy. And then, from that darkness, something stepped forward. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The thing that moved into the room was too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, black eyes that pierced through the darkness, seeing everything, knowing everything. I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped me. The thing tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, almost curious, as if it were studying me. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one more ragged than the last. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls closing in, the air growing thick and heavy with that horrible, rancid smell. "Lisa," the voice was no longer a whisper. It was right in front of me, dripping with malice, low and guttural. "I told you, to let me in." The thing took another step toward me, its long fingers twitching as they reached out, its body bending and contorting as it moved. My legs refused to obey my brain's desperate commands to run. I was trapped, rooted to the spot as the creature drew closer, its twisted form towering over me. "Please," I whimpered, the word barely escaping my throat. I didn't even know what I was pleading for. Mercy? Escape? Maybe I thought I could reason with it, though deep down I knew there was no reasoning with something like this. This wasn't a person, wasn't even a thing. It was something else. Something wrong. Something that didn't belong in this world. Its fingers brushed against my arm, cold and clammy like the touch of death itself. I recoiled, my entire body screaming in protest as the contact sent icy tendrils of fear snaking through my veins. But the creature didn't stop. Its hand wrapped around my wrist, its grip iron tight, and it pulled me closer. "Don't be afraid, Lisa," it hissed, its face lowering toward mine. "You opened the door. You invited me in." I shook my head frantically, tears streaming down my face. "No, I didn't." The creature chuckled, a horrible, wet sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. "Oh, but you did. You heard me, you listened, and now I'm here." Its grip tightened, pulling me so close that I could feel its breath, cold, rancid, like the smell of something long dead. I gasped, struggling to break free, but it was no use. The thing's strength was unimaginable, and my body felt like it was made of lead. "You shouldn't have listened, Lisa," the voice grew softer, almost mocking now. "You shouldn't have let me in." My vision blurred as panic overwhelmed me, the room spinning wildly around us. The shadows seemed to crawl up the walls, creeping closer, surrounding me, suffocating me. My lungs burned as I struggled for breath, but the air was thick, heavy, poisoned by the presence of this thing. In a final desperate attempt, I lashed out, kicking wildly with whatever strength I had left. My foot connected with something solid, and for a split second, the creature's grip loosened. I didn't waste a moment. I yanked my arm free, stumbling backward and falling to the floor with a thud. My hand scrambled along the cold wood, searching frantically for the knife I'd dropped. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its form shifting, twisting as it turned toward me. Its long fingers twitched, and it reached out again, but this time, I was ready. My fingers wrapped around the handle of the knife, and with a scream, I slashed at the thing in front of me. The blade sliced through the air, but it didn't connect with anything solid. It passed right through the creature's arm as if it were made of smoke. My heart sank as the realization hit me, this thing wasn't bound by the same rules. It wasn't something I could fight. It was something else. "Foolish girl," the creature hissed, its voice echoing through the room, louder now, almost vibrating in my skull. "You think that can hurt me? You think you can stop what's already begun?" I scrambled to my feet, backing away, my chest heaving with terror. The creature advanced slowly, its twisted form growing darker, more distorted as it moved, like a living shadow consuming the room. I was running out of time. In a blind panic, I turned and ran for the window. I didn't care how high up I was. I just knew I needed to get out of that room, away from that thing. My hands fumbled with the latch, desperate to pry it open, but my fingers were slippery with sweat, my hands shaking too violently. Behind me, I heard the thing move closer, its laughter filling the room. Lisa, it's too late. You opened the door. You let me in. And now. I yanked the window open, the cool night air rushing in. Without thinking, I pulled myself up onto the windowsill, the fear of falling nothing compared to the terror I felt inside that room. I didn't even hesitate. I jumped. The cold air engulfed me as I fell, the ground rushing up to meet me. But before I hit, I felt it, something wrapped around my ankle, pulling me back. The last thing I heard was its whisper in my ear. You can't escape me. Part 6, The Unseen Grasp. The world snapped to darkness. I didn't hit the ground, I never felt the cold, hard earth slam into me, no bones breaking, no searing pain. Instead, it felt like being ripped out of reality, like time itself had unraveled and left me floating in nothingness. My body was weightless, suspended in a black void. I could still feel the icy grip around my ankle, dragging me back, pulling me away from the escape I'd so desperately sought. My chest burned with fear. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I thrashed wildly, clawing at the air, but there was nothing to grab onto, nothing to hold me. My hands passed through the emptiness, and yet, I could feel the cold fingers tightening their hold, pulling me deeper into the abyss. Then, the darkness began to shift. Shapes emerged from the void, swirling around me like shadows moving just beyond the reach of light. They twisted and writhed, forming grotesque figures, distorted faces with hollow eyes and twisted mouths. I could hear them whispering, their voices mingling with the darkness, each one laced with a cruelty that sent shivers down my spine. Lisa. Lisa. The voices called my name, echoing from every direction, growing louder, more insistent. They mocked me, taunted me, their laughter bubbling up from the black depths of the void. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound burrowed into my mind, seeping into my thoughts like poison. You let us in. You let us in. I shut my eyes, squeezing them tight, praying that this was some twisted nightmare. But when I opened them again, I was no longer in the void. I was back in my house. The kitchen, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light, stood before me, exactly as I had left it. The front door was still open, the cold night air creeping in. The knife was on the floor where I had dropped it. Everything was the same, but I knew it wasn't. The house felt wrong. Every wall, every corner seemed darker, the shadows thicker, almost pulsing with life. The air was colder, too, biting at my skin, and the smell of decay lingered, stronger than before. My stomach churned with nausea. I took a step forward, my legs trembling beneath me, and that's when I noticed it, the quiet. The oppressive silence that seemed to fill the house, thick and heavy, like the world itself had gone still. No sound. Not the hum of the refrigerator, not the creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet. It was as if the house was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and glanced toward the hallway. The door to the stairs was ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out from the crack. My pulse quickened as I stared at it, waiting, dreading. Something was in there, still. The same thing that had followed me, that had pulled me back when I tried to jump, that was waiting just beyond the threshold. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My feet wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen, as the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch, elongating, twisting into something unnatural. And then, slowly, the door began to creak open. Lisa, the voice drifted out from the darkness, soft, mocking. Why are you hiding? My breath caught in my throat, the air too thick, too cold. I took a step back, my legs shaking so violently that I nearly collapsed. The knife was on the floor, only a few feet away, but I didn't dare reach for it. What good would it do? It hadn't worked before. It wouldn't work now. The door opened wider, and something stepped out. It wasn't the creature I'd seen before. No, this was different. Worse. It moved with a fluid grace, its body a mass of shadows that seemed to ripple and shift as it approached. Its face, if it even had a face, was hidden beneath a hood of darkness, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, watching me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, and the thing stopped, tilting its head as if curious. The silence in the room grew heavier, suffocating, as it took another step toward me. "Did you really think you could escape?" the voice whispered, low and mocking. "You let me in, Lisa. You opened the door." The word struck me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I backed up further, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. But there was no escape. The front door was still open, but the darkness outside seemed impenetrable, like a wall of black waiting to swallow me whole. I felt trapped. Cornered. And the thing knew it. It took another step, its long, spindly fingers reaching out toward me, the shadows around it writhing like snakes. I swallowed the rising scream in my throat, backing away until my back hit the cold kitchen counter. There was nowhere left to go. "Why run?" the voice cooed, softer now, almost gentle. "You invited me in. You wanted this." "No," I gasped, shaking my head frantically. "No, I didn't." "Oh, but you did." The thing took another step, its fingers brushing against the edge of the counter. "You heard me, and you listened. And now." It paused, and the silence stretched on, suffocating. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, the air growing colder with each second. "You're mine." I screamed then, louder than I ever thought I could, and threw myself toward the front door, desperate for escape. My legs moved on instinct, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I sprinted toward the open doorway. But before I could reach it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I skidded to a stop, my heart plummeting into my stomach. The door had been wide open. It had been right there. And now it was sealed, locked tight. The thing laughed, a low, rumbling sound that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I whirled around, my back against the door, my hands fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, how desperately I twisted, it wouldn't open. The thing was closer now, its twisted form towering over me, the shadows swirling around it like smoke. I could see its fingers, long and thin, reaching out toward me. "Nowhere to run, Lisa," it whispered. "You're already inside. You let me in, and I'll never leave." The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls shrinking, the air so thick it was like breathing through water. I gasped, struggling to pull in air, my body trembling with fear. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the thing reached out and placed its hand on my chest. I felt a cold, burning sensation spread through my body, like ice crawling through my veins. My vision blurred, the world spinning around me as the thing's touch seeped into my skin, its presence invading every part of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, everything went black. Part 7, The Blackness. The blackness swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I drifted there, suspended in the void, weightless, detached from reality. There was no sense of time, no sound, no light, no warmth. Just an endless, oppressive darkness that pressed against me from all sides. It felt as though I had been erased, as if I no longer existed in any tangible sense. But then, slowly, I began to feel something. A presence. Faint at first, like a whisper carried on a breeze, but it grew stronger, closer. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, surrounding me, watching me. It was the same thing that had dragged me back, that had slammed the door shut when I tried to escape. And now, it was inside me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped within myself, my mind a prisoner in this dark, suffocating abyss. Then, the whisper came again. Lisa. Lisa. It echoed in my head, soft and mocking, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a serpent. I felt it slithering through my mind, probing, searching, finding the deepest, darkest parts of me. I wanted to fight it, to push it out, but I couldn't. It was too strong. You let me in, the voice cooed, sweet and venomous. You let me in, and now. The blackness began to shift around me, swirling like a storm, the edges of reality warping, stretching. Shapes started to emerge from the darkness, grotesque and twisted, like the nightmares that linger just beyond the edge of sleep. Faces appeared, horrible, distorted faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, their features contorted in expressions of agony. They twisted and writhed, reaching out for me with clawed hands, their voices a cacophony of tortured screams. And then I saw them, my parents. Their faces were pale, gaunt, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls, their lips cracked and dry. My father's mouth was twisted into a silent scream, while my mother's head hung limply to one side, as if her neck had been broken. They stared at me, their empty eyes pleading, accusing. No. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the blackness. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the images didn't fade. They grew sharper, clearer, the grotesque details of their faces burned into my mind. And the voice, his voice, laughed. Oh, but it is, Lisa, it whispered. This is what you've done. This is what you've invited into your home. I shook my head, trying to clear the images from my mind, but they wouldn't go away. The faces of my parents morphed into something worse, blood dripping from their mouths, their eyes wide and lifeless, their bodies twisted and broken as if they had been dropped from a great height. Stop! I cried, though no sound came. Stop it. This isn't real. But the voice continued, relentless, cruel. They're gone, Lisa. And you know why? Because you let me in. You invited me. You wanted this. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the images, the voice, but it was inside me now, in my head, burrowing deeper with each passing second. The blackness swirled around me, the faces of my parents twisting and warping into something monstrous, their eyes hollow, accusing. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and I flinched, my body jerking violently. I opened my eyes and found myself back in my house. The kitchen, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light, was exactly as it had been when I had last seen it. But something was wrong. Everything looked distorted, as if I were seeing it through a cracked lens. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling beneath me, and that's when I saw the blood. It was everywhere. The floor was slick with it, pooling in dark, glistening puddles that reflected the dim light from the ceiling. It dripped down the walls, smeared across the countertops, splattered across the cabinets. My breath caught in my throat as I stared down at my hands, covered in crimson. I staggered backward, my stomach churning with nausea. The smell of copper and decay filled the air, thick and suffocating. I gasped, trying to breathe, but the stench was overwhelming, choking me. What have I done? I whispered, though I wasn't sure if the words were even real. And then I saw the bodies. They were lying in the middle of the kitchen, twisted and broken, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, their faces hidden beneath a thick layer of blood. But I knew who they were. My parents. No, the word escaped my lips as a strangled gasp, my vision blurring with tears. No, this isn't happening, this isn't real. I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as I reached out toward them, but as soon as my fingers brushed their cold, lifeless skin, the scene shifted. I was no longer in the kitchen. I was back in the void. The blackness. The cold, empty abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. The bodies of my parents were gone. The blood was gone. Everything was gone. Except for him. The voice returned, low and menacing, filling the emptiness around me. Lisa, you can't run from this. You can't run from me. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped, paralyzed by the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my chest heaving as I struggled to escape the suffocating blackness. You let me in, Lisa, the voice hissed, closer now, right in my ear. You opened the door. And now. I felt something cold and slimy brush against my neck, and I flinched, recoiling in horror. Now you're mine. Suddenly, the blackness shifted again, and I was thrown back into the house. This time, I wasn't in the kitchen. I was in my bedroom, standing by the open window. The night air blew in, cold and biting, but the shadows in the room were wrong. They twisted and stretched, contorting into grotesque shapes that writhed and pulsed. I turned toward the bed, and my heart stopped. There was someone lying there. At first, I thought it was me, my body, still and lifeless on the bed. But as I stepped closer, the figure shifted, turning toward me. And then I realized. It wasn't me. It was him. The thing from the hallway. The twisted, shadowy figure that had entered my house, that had whispered my name through the walls, that had wrapped its cold fingers around my throat. It was lying in my bed, its eyes wide open, staring at me with that same cold, black gaze. I screamed and backed away, but the thing didn't move. It just lay there, staring, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. You let me in, Lisa, it whispered, its voice echoing through the room. Now you can never leave. And then, the door behind me slammed shut, trapping me inside. Part 8, The Room of No Escape. The slam of the door was deafening, like the final note of some cursed melody. I spun around, my back pressed hard against the wall as I stared at the closed door, the weight of it sealing me inside with the thing in my bed. My breath came in frantic bursts, each inhale sharp and painful, as if the very air in the room had turned against me. The thing on the bed hadn't moved. It lay there, twisted and contorted, its form barely human, as though it had been pulled from some deep, dark place that defied the natural world. The sheets around it were soaked, dark and slick with something I didn't want to name. But those eyes, black, hollow pits, never left mine. They followed me as if they could see straight into my soul. A low chuckle bubbled from its mouth, the sound wet and gurgling, as though it were laughing from deep within its chest. It was the kind of laugh that didn't belong to anything alive. The sound made my skin crawl, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. You're home now, Lisa, it hissed, its voice wrapping around me like a cold wind. You can't run from what you've invited in. I shook my head, trying to block out its words, but they slithered into my mind, burrowing deep, making me doubt my own thoughts. My back pressed harder against the wall, as if I could melt into it, vanish from this nightmare. But I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The window, the open window. It was my only way out. My last hope. I turned toward it, feeling the cold wind whip against my face, the night outside so quiet, so still. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, instinct driving me forward as I scrambled toward the window, desperate to escape. I didn't care how high up I was, didn't care what waited for me out there, anything was better than staying in this room, with it. But as I reached the window, something changed. The darkness outside wasn't right. It wasn't just the normal shadowy depths of night. No, it was thick, impenetrable, like a solid wall of black that seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. My hand hovered over the window frame, my heart pounding in my chest, but something inside me screamed not to go through. There was something waiting for me out there. Something worse. I could feel it. I backed away, my breath quickening as I tried to make sense of it. I turned back to the room, hoping for some other way out. But what greeted me was worse than anything I could have imagined. The thing had moved. It was no longer lying on the bed. Now it stood in the center of the room, its body twisted and hunched, its limbs too long, its fingers curling like talons. Its black eyes, cold and lifeless, bore into me with a hunger that made my stomach turn. The air grew colder, and I could feel it again, that overwhelming presence, that crushing weight. "I told you," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "There's no leaving now. You're mine." I stumbled backward, my eyes darting toward the door, but I knew it was pointless. The door wouldn't open. I could feel it, as if the entire house had sealed itself shut, trapping me inside with this thing that now called me its own. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, stretching and twisting as if they were alive, reaching out toward me. I clutched at my chest, the air thick and heavy in my lungs, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. "No!" I screamed, shaking my head. "This isn't real. You're not real." The thing tilted its head, its grotesque smile widening. "Not real?" It stepped forward, the shadows curling around its feet like smoke. "You invited me in, Lisa. You opened the door. And now, you belong to me." With each step it took, the room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in on me, the ceiling pressing down. I was suffocating, trapped in a shrinking cage of darkness. My back hit the wall again, and I felt the cold surface behind me pulse, as if the house itself was breathing, alive with the same malevolence that filled the creature. "Let me show you what's real," it whispered, and suddenly, the room changed. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around me, pulling me into a vortex of darkness. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was falling, tumbling through the blackness. The walls dissolved, the floor vanished, and the air was ripped from my lungs as the world around me shifted into something new, something worse. When the darkness receded, I found myself standing in a hallway, a long, dimly lit corridor that stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were lined with doors, each one identical, closed, waiting. The floor beneath my feet was cold, slick with something wet that clung to my shoes with every step I took. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a foul, suffocating odor that made my stomach churn. I spun around, disoriented, confused. How had I gotten here? Was this still my house? It couldn't be. This place was wrong, twisted. Every instinct screamed that I didn't belong here. But there was nowhere else to go. The laughter returned, echoing down the hallway, bouncing off the walls. I turned toward the sound, my body trembling with fear. And then I saw it, the thing from the room. It was at the end of the hallway, standing still, its dark form barely visible in the shadows. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, watching me, waiting. I took a step back, my heart racing. I had to get out. I had to find a way out. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The hallway stretched on and on, the doors blurring past me as I sprinted down the endless corridor. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The laughter grew louder, closer, as if the thing was right behind me, chasing me, hunting me. I reached for the nearest door, my fingers fumbling with the handle, desperate to escape. But the door wouldn't budge. I tried another one. And another. But each door was locked, sealed shut, trapping me in this endless nightmare. The walls began to close in, the hallway shrinking around me. The lights overhead flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the walls. I could feel it, him, closing in on me, his presence like a weight on my chest, crushing me from the inside. "Lisa," the voice echoed through the hallway, mocking, relentless. "You can't run forever." I stumbled to a stop, my back against one of the doors, gasping for breath. My hands trembled as I gripped the handle, pulling with all my strength, but it refused to open. Panic surged through me as the sound of footsteps echoed behind me, slow, deliberate. He was coming. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable, but then, something clicked. The door behind me gave way, swinging open with a groan. I fell backward, tumbling into the room beyond, and scrambled to my feet. My heart raced as I slammed the door shut behind me, the darkness of the hallway vanishing as I locked myself inside. But as I turned around, I realized that I wasn't alone. The room was small, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. And in the center of the room stood a figure, a woman. Her back was to me, her long, dark hair hanging limply over her shoulders, her head bowed as if she were asleep. "Hello?" My voice came out as a whisper, trembling with fear. Who are you?" The woman didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, her body swaying slightly as if she were being rocked by some unseen force. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as I waited, my breath shallow and ragged. Then, slowly, the woman turned. Her face, oh God, her face. It wasn't a face at all. Just a mass of darkness, writhing and shifting like a storm of shadows, twisting and distorting in the dim light. And then, from that black, hollow void, two eyes opened, cold, lifeless eyes that stared straight into mine. "You let him in," the woman said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You let him in, and now, there's no way out." I staggered backward, my entire body trembling as the room seemed to close in around me. The walls began to pulse, the air thickening with the stench of rot. The shadows crawled along the floor, creeping toward me, swallowing the light. And then, the door behind me slammed shut. I was trapped. And there was no escape. Part 9, The Mirror of Shadows. The door behind me slammed shut, sealing me inside the dim room with the faceless woman. The air was thick, oppressive, and the stench of rot clung to my skin, making it hard to breathe. My heart pounded wildly in my chest, my throat tight with terror. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out, only the deafening silence, broken by the woman's slow, raspy breath. Her shadowy form flickered, like a candle on the verge of going out, and her eyes, those cold, hollow eyes, never left mine. She stood there, swaying, her body slightly bent, as if she was waiting for something, for me to do something. My hands shook at my sides, my mind racing for a way out, for anything that could save me from this nightmare. But then she spoke again, her voice low, barely above a whisper, and yet it echoed through the room. "You let him in, and now, you can't leave." Her words seemed to linger in the air, twisting around me like a noose tightening around my neck. I took a step back, my body pressed against the door, but there was no escape. The walls seemed to pulse, the ceiling closing in as if the very room was shrinking around me. What do you mean?" I stammered, barely able to force the words out. The woman didn't answer. She simply turned, her body moving unnaturally, like a puppet on invisible strings. Her dark hair swayed as she faced the far wall, and then she pointed. Slowly, deliberately, her bony finger extended toward the opposite side of the room. There, in the shadows, hung a mirror. It was old, the glass cracked and darkened with age. Its ornate, tarnished frame seemed to glimmer in the dim light, almost as if it were pulsing with its own life. The room's flickering bulb reflected weakly in the glass, casting strange, distorted reflections that made my stomach churn. "Look," the woman hissed, her voice like wind scraping across brittle leaves. "See what you've done." I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed to look away, to run. But there was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. I was trapped, surrounded by shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't, closing in, suffocating me with their presence. The mirror seemed to pull me toward it, like it had its own gravity, a silent demand that I look, that I confront whatever horrors waited inside. My feet moved on their own, dragging me forward. I didn't want to go closer, but my body betrayed me, inching toward the mirror as if I had no control. The woman stood motionless behind me, her twisted face still hidden, but I could feel her eyes, those empty, accusing eyes, boring into the back of my head. The closer I got to the mirror, the more distorted the room became. The shadows flickered unnaturally, stretching long and thin, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to writhe on the walls. The air grew colder, the smell of rot intensifying, filling my lungs with every breath I took. When I was finally close enough, I raised my trembling hand, my fingers just inches from the glass. My reflection looked back at me, but it wasn't me. The face in the mirror was mine, but twisted, distorted, as though something was trying to crawl out from underneath my skin. My eyes were wide, bloodshot, black veins running through the whites like cracks in shattered glass. My mouth was open in a silent scream, lips cracked and bleeding, my teeth sharp and jagged, more like fangs than anything human. I recoiled, stumbling backward, a wave of nausea crashing over me. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But the reflection didn't change. It stood there, staring back at me with that horrible, twisted expression, as if mocking me. Behind me, the woman laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down my spine. "Do you see it now, Lisa?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You let him in. And now, he's inside you." I shook my head frantically, tears welling in my eyes. No. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But the reflection was relentless. It didn't move as I did, didn't follow the way a normal reflection would. Instead, it leaned closer to the glass, its lips curling into a sickening smile. I watched in horror as it raised its hand, pressing its palm against the inside of the mirror, as if it were trying to break through. And then I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder. I gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. The woman was still standing by the far wall, her back to me, her long hair hanging like a curtain of shadows. But the sensation lingered, the icy touch burning into my skin like a brand. I turned back to the mirror, my breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. The figure inside the glass was closer now, its face pressed against the surface, its breath fogging the cracked glass. It was me, and yet it wasn't. It was him, the thing I had let in, the darkness that had seeped into my soul. And now, it wanted out. The glass began to crack, thin lines spiderwebbing across the surface as the reflection pushed harder, its twisted fingers scraping against the inside of the mirror. I stumbled backward again, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in this room, in this nightmare, with no escape. I watched, helpless, as the cracks in the glass spread, jagged lines cutting through the reflection like scars. The figure inside grinned wider, its black eyes gleaming with malice. It raised one hand and slammed it against the glass, and with a deafening shatter, the mirror exploded. I screamed, throwing my hands up to shield my face as shards of glass rained down around me, slicing into my skin. But the pain was nothing compared to the terror that gripped me when I realized what had happened. The reflection, the thing inside the mirror, was gone. I looked around the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. But there was no sign of it. The mirror was shattered, the floor littered with shards of broken glass, but the twisted reflection had vanished. Then, from behind me, I heard the whisper. "Lisa." I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the voice slithered through the room, soft and mocking. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me. But I had no choice. Slowly, I turned, my heart in my throat. The woman was gone. In her place, standing just a few feet away, was the thing from the mirror. It was tall, its limbs long and twisted, its eyes black and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. But its face was mine. It stepped toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked along by invisible strings. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. "You can't run from me, Lisa," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "I'm inside you now. You let me in, and now." It reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my arm, sending a shock of ice through my veins. "We're the same," I screamed, jerking away from its touch, my body trembling with terror. But as I backed into the corner of the room, my heart hammering in my chest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection, my real reflection, was still in the broken shards of the mirror. And it was watching me, its eyes wide with horror, just as terrified as I was. Because it wasn't me anymore. It was trapped. Part 10, The Bound Reflection. I stared at the shards of glass scattered across the floor, my chest tightening with dread. My real reflection was still there, trapped inside the broken pieces. It was me, my face, my eyes, looking out from the jagged fragments. But I was no longer in control. I wasn't me anymore. My reflection's eyes were wide with terror, lips moving soundlessly as if begging me to let her out. Her hands pressed against the inside of the glass, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't break free. It was as if the pieces of the mirror had become her prison, locking her away while the thing standing in front of me, the twisted version of myself, had taken my place. My breath came in shallow gasps as the creature took another step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, each one dripping with malice. Its face, my face, was a grotesque parody of my own, twisted into a grin too wide, its eyes black pits of emptiness. The thing looked at me as if it knew exactly what I was feeling, like it relished the terror coursing through me. It raised one hand, its long fingers curling as they reached out toward me. I recoiled, pressing myself against the cold wall, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. But the room was small, and there was nowhere left to run. "You let me in, Lisa," it said, its voice slithering through the air like a serpent. "You wanted this." I shook my head frantically, my body trembling uncontrollably. No, I didn't. I never wanted this." The thing's smile widened, and it took another step, its fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was cold, so cold it burned. I flinched, jerking away, but its grip tightened, holding me in place. "You did," it whispered. "You opened the door. You listened to me. And now, you're mine." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound of its voice, the feel of its hand on my skin. But it was everywhere, inside me, filling every corner of my mind. The terror was overwhelming, suffocating, and I could feel myself slipping, losing grip on the world around me. But then, something shifted. A faint sound, like the softest of whispers, brushed against my ears. It wasn't coming from the creature in front of me. No. It was coming from the shards of the mirror on the floor. I opened my eyes, glancing down at the broken pieces. My reflection, the real me, was moving, her lips forming silent words, her hands pressing harder against the inside of the glass. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was trying to tell me something. I couldn't hear her, but I could see the urgency in her eyes. She was pointing to something on the floor, something just out of reach. My gaze followed her gesture, and there, among the scattered glass, was a large shard, its surface gleaming darkly in the dim light. I didn't know why, but I knew I had to reach it. Somehow, I understood. That shard was my only hope. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged forward, my hand shooting out to grab the shard. The creature's grip tightened on my arm, its fingers digging into my flesh with impossible strength, but I ignored the pain. My fingers closed around the shard, the sharp edge biting into my palm, drawing blood. The moment my hand touched the shard, everything changed. A jolt of energy shot through me, as if the glass itself was alive, pulsing with power. The room seemed to shift, the shadows swirling, twisting, recoiling from the light that now radiated from the shard in my hand. The creature, my twisted reflection, hissed, its black eyes narrowing as it pulled back, its fingers releasing my arm. "No," it growled, its voice low and guttural. "No, you can't." I didn't let it finish. With a surge of adrenaline, I slashed the shard through the air, aiming for the creature's face. It tried to dodge, but I was quicker. The sharp edge of the glass cut deep into its skin, slicing through the blackness that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. A horrible, high-pitched screech filled the room, the creature staggering back, its form flickering, warping. I didn't stop. I swung the shard again, and again, each strike cutting deeper, tearing through the twisted version of myself. The creature writhed, its body distorting, melting into the shadows, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a windstorm. "You can't escape," it snarled, its voice warping, breaking apart. "You opened the door, Lisa, you let me in." But as I drove the shard deeper into its chest, something inside me knew that it was lying. This thing wasn't invincible. It wasn't unstoppable. I had let it in, yes, but I could also drive it out. With one final scream, I plunged the shard into its heart. The creature let out a deafening wail, its body convulsing, the blackness inside it erupting like thick smoke. I stumbled backward, watching in horror as the thing began to dissolve, its limbs turning to ash, its face, my face, melting into a twisted, grotesque mess. And then, with a final, sickening lurch, it was gone. The room was silent. I stood there, panting, my body shaking with exhaustion, the shard still clutched tightly in my hand. The air was thick with the scent of burning, and the shadows in the room seemed to have retreated, no longer pulsing with that malevolent energy. I looked down at the shards of the mirror scattered around my feet. My reflection was still there, staring up at me with wide eyes, her lips trembling. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was relief. I dropped to my knees, my body shaking uncontrollably as I reached for the largest shard. My reflection mirrored my movements, her hand pressed against the inside of the glass, just as desperate to make contact as I was. When our hands met, something incredible happened. A blinding light erupted from the glass, filling the room with a warmth I hadn't felt in what seemed like hours. My body felt weightless, as if the darkness that had gripped me was being pulled away, drawn out by the light. The tension in my chest eased, the suffocating fear lifting as the warmth spread through me, filling me with a sense of peace. The shards of the mirror began to glow, each one lighting up like stars in the night. And then, one by one, they started to reform. The cracks in the glass mended themselves, the pieces fusing together as if they had never been broken at all. The mirror, once shattered, was whole again. And I was free. I collapsed to the floor, my body weak and trembling, but the terror that had gripped me was gone. The thing, the twisted version of myself, was gone. I was back in my own body, my own mind. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt like I could breathe. But as I lay there, staring up at the now whole mirror, I realized something that sent a chill racing down my spine. The room wasn't entirely silent. From somewhere deep within the glass, so faint I could barely hear it, came a whisper. "Lisa." It wasn't over. Part 11, The Whispering Glass. The faint whisper echoed from the mirror, chilling my blood. I lay on the floor, my heart still racing, the warmth that had filled the room beginning to fade, replaced by a gnawing dread. I wanted to believe it was over, that the thing I had fought, the twisted version of myself, was gone. But as the whisper grew louder, insistent, I knew the nightmare hadn't ended. It had just changed. "Lisa," the voice called again, this time louder, clearer, as if it were speaking directly to me from the other side of the glass. I forced myself to sit up, my body trembling, my mind screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from the mirror as possible. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me toward it, a magnetic force that I couldn't resist, as if the mirror itself was demanding my attention. I stared at it. The surface now smooth, pristine, as though it had never been shattered. My reflection was back, my real reflection. But it wasn't moving. It just stood there, frozen, staring back at me with wide eyes that mirrored my own terror. And then, slowly, the lips of the reflection began to move. "Help me," it mouthed. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the mirror, shaking my head. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I had freed myself. I had fought off the creature. I was back in control of my body. So how could my reflection still be trapped? "Help me," the reflection repeated, its lips trembling, eyes pleading. I could feel the desperation radiating from it, as though it was alive, as though it were me. And in that moment, the truth hit me with terrifying clarity. I wasn't free. The thing I thought I had defeated wasn't the real threat. It had been a trick, a distraction. The real danger wasn't in the room with me, it was still inside the mirror. And somehow, I had left part of myself behind. The part that was real, the part that belonged in this world, was still trapped on the other side. I wasn't whole. The realization made my stomach turn. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, the walls of the room seeming to close in around me once again. The mirror pulsed with a strange, eerie glow, and the voice, the whisper, grew louder. "Lisa, you can't leave me here." I looked around wildly, searching for a way out, but the room felt smaller, darker. My only escape had been through the glass, but now that same mirror was a prison, holding a part of me hostage. The fear clawed at my throat, and I had no idea what to do. But then, the voice changed. It wasn't just my reflection anymore. It was something else, something darker. "You belong here," the voice hissed, deeper now, colder. "You can't escape me." The glass rippled, as though it were water disturbed by a stone. My reflection began to change, its face contorting, eyes darkening, until the familiar black pits of the creature stared back at me from the other side. Its twisted smile widened, and my blood ran cold as I realized I was no longer looking at myself. I was looking at him. "No," I whispered, stepping back in horror. "You're gone. I killed you." The creature laughed, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Its form writhed inside the mirror, twisting and stretching, the shadows swirling around it like a storm. "You can't kill me, Lisa," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You let me in. I'm part of you now. And no matter where you run, no matter what you do, I will always be here." The mirror shimmered, and suddenly, the reflection shifted again. This time, I saw myself, not the twisted version, not the creature, but me, standing alone in the room, just as I had been moments before. The terror in my reflection's eyes mirrored my own, but now there was something else in those eyes. Something sinister. I stepped closer to the mirror, despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to stop. The closer I got, the more I could feel it, the pull of the glass, the weight of the darkness behind it. My fingers hovered over the surface, and as I touched it, the cold seeped into my skin, freezing me to the bone. The reflection smiled. "Come closer," it whispered. "Come back to where you belong." My hand trembled as I pressed my palm against the glass, the cold biting into my flesh. I could feel the mirror pulling me in, like it was a living thing, hungry for my soul. My reflection's smile widened, and I realized with horror that it was no longer just a reflection. It was waiting for me to return, to fall into the trap I had barely escaped. "No," I said, trying to pull my hand back. "I won't let you take me." But the glass wouldn't let go. My fingers felt stuck, the cold spreading through my arm, paralyzing me. The mirror began to ripple again, and the reflection's face distorted, the black eyes widening with hunger. It was trying to pull me back in, to replace me, to take control. I struggled, pulling with all my strength, but the harder I fought, the stronger the pull became. I could feel the darkness behind the glass, waiting to consume me, to drag me back into the void. And then, I heard it. A knock. It came from behind me, soft but deliberate. My breath hitched, and I turned my head, expecting to see something horrifying, expecting the nightmare to be waiting, smiling. But the door behind me was open. And standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light of the hallway, was my mother. She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes, her face pale. "Lisa," she whispered. "What are you doing?" I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding in my chest, my body frozen in place. My hand was still pressed against the glass, but I could feel the mirror loosening its grip, as if the presence of my mother had disrupted its power. "Mom?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. She took a step closer, her eyes scanning the room, her expression growing more alarmed. "Lisa, come away from that mirror. Something's wrong. I can feel it." Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to pull myself free from the glass. My mother reached out, her hand grabbing mine, and with a sharp tug, she pulled me away from the mirror. The cold broke, and I stumbled backward, collapsing into her arms. For a moment, I was overwhelmed with relief, my body shaking as I buried my face in her shoulder. She held me tightly, her hand stroking my hair, whispering words of comfort. But when I looked back at the mirror, my blood ran cold. The reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was hers. The figure in the mirror stared back at me with my mother's face, her eyes wide, her expression frozen in horror. She pressed her hands against the inside of the glass, just like I had done before, her lips moving soundlessly, as if begging for help. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No." I looked up at the woman holding me, my heart pounding with dread. The thing that had taken her place smiled down at me, its black eyes gleaming. "You let me in, Lisa," it whispered, its voice soft and cruel. "And now, you're mine." The door behind me slammed shut. Part 12, The Final Door. The door slammed shut with a force that reverberated through my entire body. I stumbled out of the creature's grip, my legs weak and my chest heaving. My mind was reeling, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might tear through my ribs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I stared at the thing that wore my mother's face, watching as its smile twisted into something dark, cruel. The woman who had once been my mother was gone, and in her place was the very thing I had tried so desperately to fight, now in the guise of the one person I trusted most. I staggered backward, my eyes darting between the twisted version of my mother and the mirror behind her. My real mother, her true reflection, was trapped inside, banging on the glass, her mouth moving soundlessly as she pleaded with me to let her out. Her eyes were wide with terror, her hands pressed against the glass just as mine had been earlier. But I didn't know how. I didn't know how to save her. "You should have listened, Lisa," the creature purred, stepping closer, its black eyes narrowing with sadistic pleasure. "Now there's no escape." My hands shook, the room spinning as the walls seemed to close in on me. The air was thick with that familiar scent of rot, suffocating me, making my stomach churn. I felt dizzy, like the ground beneath me was unstable, shifting like the floor of a ship in rough seas. I reached out, gripping the edge of a table to steady myself, my mind racing, desperately searching for a way out. But every door was closed. The house had become a prison. No matter where I turned,